is the official start, so welcome. This webinar session for the social enterprise sector, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Daniela Ginas. Looking forward to a really inspiring session from Daniela. But this is very much the enterprise innovation and recovery video that we wanted to put out as people are looking at the whole topic around innovation and growth. We have looked previously at how we can actually support social enterprises through managing their own mental health, through leadership modules that Sarah very kindly went through in June. And we've also looked at things like finance and funding. So we've covered a range of topics, but this one is very much about that enterprise innovation and growth. So we are looking at how do we do all this stuff that is being talked about. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have Daniela here. So I first met Daniela when she was managing one of her own social enterprises, Aspire for You, probably close to 10 years ago even, certainly 7 or 8 years ago, I think. But Daniela is an amazing woman who has sort of rolled with opportunities, changes in marketplaces, changes in circumstances, etc., and really sort of come through all of that with her own social enterprise journey, and is now an internationally and award-winning recognised public speaker around motivation and innovation. And you work very predominantly with women in social enterprises, small businesses, and help kind of support and encourage them. And I love your tagline. So I'm going to pop this down now. So it's think big, take action, keep pushing, which is never more relevant than now, is it? So how are you doing today, Daniela, anyway?
I'm good. Just as a heads up, I do have a 5-year-old that's in the house. So at some point during this, she may come running in and sit on my lap.
That's fine. We're all in unusual circumstances, and actually it's been great that we kind of have all of you, we get to know each other so much better, I think, sometimes in some of these situations where we're all in our own homes. You can see my plants behind me. You've probably had a scale, those of you that joined me early on, as to how much they're growing in lockdown and how much my hair has grown as well. So no problem at all. So you're well today. Got a busy day ahead, no doubt, as well.
Yeah, well, the juggling of working, supporting clients, managing the 5-year-old husband that just popped his head through the door. So there's always a lot going on in my house.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, we're delighted to have you with us, Daniela. Thank you. Could I just very briefly ask everybody to pop themselves onto mute, just so that we, as we go through the session, everybody's got really sort of clear audio on Daniela and the conversation. If anybody would like to ask any questions, pop them into the chat box at the bottom of your screens. And then we'll kind of like have a short catch up at the end, and we'll have the opportunity to do that sort of Q&A. So Daniela, one of the things that I've known about yourself through your previous social enterprise, which is Aspire for You, sort of working with young people and supporting them to gain confidence and even to move into employment. But that was very much an arts-based social enterprise, wasn't it?
Yeah, so we did training primarily around performing arts, so vocal coaching, dance, video production, so performing and creative arts, video production, music production. We did stuff around fashion, but also kind of event management and entrepreneurship. So we tried to cover quite a diverse range of areas, but primarily those things that were more creative. And that was specifically because I was always quite creative and wanted to provide opportunities for young people like me then, because I was young then, in the kind of more creative space.
Oh, fantastic. And since then you've kind of like gone on to just do amazing things. I know that you founded She's the Boss, sort of the business that has also spun out of your consultancy business, and that was about 2016. But you are you've got an MBA, you've got a master's, you've been through the Goldman Sachs 10,000 business program, you're a graduate of School of Social Entrepreneurs. You have done so many things. You're a visiting lecturer as well, and a trustee of charities, so, and a radio presenter. So
Yes.
for someone who I understand, and correct me please if I'm wrong, that when you were younger, and maybe part of the reason that you got into the performing arts, you were actually quite shy about public speaking. So to do international public speaker on motivation and a radio presenter, that's real sort of overcoming personal obstacles perhaps as well, which then you've taken into your business and why you do what you do now.
Yeah, so my kind of upbringing, which I'm quite vocal about, I did come from an inner city community. I was surrounded by, I suppose, deprivation, and it wasn't the most aspirational of beginnings. And I think part of my kind of environment, I suppose, made me feel, I don't want to say trapped, but I can't think of a better word to describe it. And I always had big aspirations, but didn't necessarily have the confidence to be able to articulate that. And from a very young age, very quiet, very insular, but very, I suppose, inwardly driven. Luckily for me, around the age of 16, I was taken, I suppose, mentored by a friend's dad who ran a mentoring organization called Build. And he was really, really supportive, and I suppose recognized something in me that I didn't recognize in myself. But in order for me to, I suppose, fulfill the dreams that I had and also my potential, it was important that I found my voice. So he threw me in at the deep end to enable that to happen. So he would take me around the country to youth conferences, and he'd arrange for me to speak at these youth conferences, but he wouldn't tell me. So I'd be sat in the audience, and then they'd say, Daniela Ginas from Build Mentor Organization is coming to speak about the work that they're doing. And I would kind of be like, but I suppose my kind of lack of confidence was outweighed by my fear of embarrassment, or the fear of embarrassment outweighed the lack of confidence. So I would get up and kind of fumble it together. And after a while, I kind of preempted it was going to happen, and therefore would prep myself. And after a while, it kind of became second nature. I then went on to university. I did a degree in media and communications with radio production as my specialism. And one of the first things that they did on the degree program was get us to do a presentation every week for about 6 months. So the kind of training that my friend's dad had given me worked amazingly. And from then, I suppose, it's weird. I went to university and I wouldn't say my personality changed, but I stepped into who I believe that I always probably should have been. So I found my
your truth.
Yeah, found the confidence, found the voice, and I've kind of not looked back since. And it's been really helpful in enabling me to, I suppose, succeed on this entrepreneurial journey. But there has obviously been other obstacles. So the obstacle of lack of confidence was just one in a long list of obstacles that I've faced over the years.
Okay. And that's really interesting because the topics that we're going to discuss today, we are going to look at innovation for growth, and we're going to look at strategies for growth. But really the first topic that I think you wanted to cover was that sort of the obstacle side of it, and how those can give you lessons for growth, whether that's personal growth or whether that's leading within your enterprise.
Yes, definitely. And I think the first thing, the first part I would like to start on is the experience of running a social enterprise. And when I speak of the obstacles that I've encountered on my journey, a large proportion of them was whilst I was running Aspire for You.
Okay.
The first kind of point being, I started Aspire for You with 3 other women in business who I'd gone to university with, who were really good friends when we started on the journey. And the kind of first lesson I learned was you shouldn't go into business with friends just because it sounds like a good idea. It sounded like a good idea at the time. It wasn't a good idea in practice. And within the first year, we went from 4 of us to just me, with a lot of falling outs along the way. A very kind of painful lesson for me because it meant that I lost 3 friends during that period. Another kind of specific obstacle was my lack of understanding and awareness of really how to run an effective social enterprise. My focus was solely really on the social side as opposed to the enterprise side. And this is something that I've seen with a lot of social entrepreneurs. We're so passionate about making a difference and making an impact that sometimes the enterprise part of the business can kind of fall by the wayside whilst we chase impact. For me, that manifested in me generating, and it's kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time. I was able to secure a lot of funding for the business in the first few years. When I kind of look back and totaled how much it was close to £250,000 of funding from a variety of different funding streams. And what that enabled me to do was to really provide the impact that I wanted to by running a variety of training programs for the young people that I was trying to target. So it was a blessing on one side, but where it wasn't a blessing was that because I had been enabled to just focus on the social side by the funding, it meant that I could just leave the kind of enterprise bit and not look at it until it got to a point where I realized, and I remember getting my accounts back and it's saying that my turnover was like £272 for the year, but we'd had about £100,000 worth of money go through the account, but because it was funded income, it wasn't classed. And therefore, if you went to Companies House, it looked like we'd only turned over £272. And that was a huge eye-opener for me, because outwardly it looked like we were really successful, but if you went and looked on under the Companies House return, it looked like we weren't even running a business, because what is £272? And that was trying to overcome that and rebalance the business so that the funded income didn't outweigh the commercial income was a huge challenge, particularly because I had built this reputation around being this youth engagement business. When I then tried to kind of backtrack and focus a little bit more heavily on doing the corporate events, which is what the business initially was set up to do. So it was kind of two stages. We were supposed to do corporate events, use the finance from that to provide training for the young people, and then the young people that were trained would then perform at the corporate events that we helped to put on. So our events specialized in kind of celebration events. But because I hadn't needed to do those events to pay for the training, then when I was going out to the corporates to say, hey, kind of pay us to do your events, it was kind of like, aren't you a charity? And there was a big disconnect between the corporates and the kind of social enterprise space. So this was 2007, 2008, 9 onwards. There didn't seem to be a clear understanding by the corporates of what a social enterprise was. And a lot of the organizations we approached believed that we were a charity. And they'd say, yeah, do our events for free. Obviously, I can't run a business by doing free events. It's not possible. And that was a huge obstacle. And actually, in the long run, is what led to me having to sell the business, because I wasn't able to redress that balance at all. Whilst I was able to start doing corporate events, because we'd been so heavily funded, it was not possible for me to achieve the same level of commercial income that we were achieving with the funded income. But the outcomes that we were having with the young people were phenomenal. So it was kind of like, on one hand, I was panicking, like, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? But on the other hand, I was having young people coming and saying, because of you, I've gone to university, because of you, I've started a business, because of you, I haven't gone down this dangerous path that I was going. So it was a really kind of difficult situation, because I wanted to really continue to provide that impact for the young people, but also recognize that it wasn't really a sustainable business. I then applied for the Unlimited Big Venture Challenge and won a place on the program, and started to look at investment as a strategy for growth, to bring on some new staff, particularly those who are experienced in commercial sales, which I wasn't, and was going through that process, feeling really confident about it. Had investors say that they were going to invest, and at the last minute, the investors pulled out. And that was kind of like the rug being pulled from underneath me, because I was convinced that we're going to get this investment, going to get these new staff, the business is going to be fine, I can continue doing this social stuff over here, which I enjoy, and they can go over there and do the commercial kind of stuff that I don't really want to do. And yeah, then they pulled the investment. And it seemed like it would be okay, because I knew that Unlimited was supposed to match fund the investment, but I'd also managed to get some match funding from Birmingham City Council. So when the investment was initially pulled, I was kind of disheartened, but I thought we were already overfunding by having 3 different pots of money. So it'll be fine, we'll just focus on the 2. But then Unlimited said that they can't match grant funding, they can only match investment. So then we lost all of the funds that we were going to use to kind of grow the business. And I actually was in the process of considering closing the business down because I was pregnant at the time with my daughter. My mom was ill in hospital in another city. And the investor said, we will give you the investment in 6 months, but you have to achieve a specific number of sales. But I knew I wasn't going to be able to do that with a new baby. So I then had somebody make an offer to buy the business, and I sold it. And the business is still in operation today, doing very different things to what I initially did, but it's still in progress. And I suppose the biggest lessons for me, which there were many, keep pushing being one of the main lessons. And there's loads of different things that happened in between that. So there's loads of other things, but I don't want to kind of labor the point too much. But the kind of biggest lessons for me were around this idea of thinking big. So one of the key areas that I think really held me back is I really was just focused on, okay, I'm going to do these things with the funding, but not necessarily understanding the power that actually me as an entrepreneur would have been able to generate had I really gone hard and said, right, I'm going to build the commercial side of the business, and not being afraid. I was very much afraid of hearing the word no. So, and I remember this process in my life so vividly that I would say, right, next week I'm going to start this sales process, and I'd create a big list. I think at one point I had like 100 prospects, and then I would say on Monday I'm going to call 10, Tuesday I'm going to call 10 every day, and it would get to Monday, I'd call 2 or 3, 2 people wouldn't answer, the third person would say they're not interested, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, nobody wants to work with me, I'm not doing this anymore.
And then we've all been in that situation within our workplaces, kind of thing, and particularly as a social entrepreneur and the leader of a business, that is your responsibility, isn't it? Whether it's within your own skill set or whether it's bringing somebody else in to support you, maybe at a time when you can't afford to technically kind of bring somebody else into the business. But I think that kind of fear of no, that procrastination, I'll go and do something else first, and then I'll do it, and then I'll do it, and then I'll do it, is a really common challenge for most of us.
Yeah, and it's something that continued until it got to a point where, okay, I've procrastinated so long that it's gone past the point of return now. So that would definitely be one of the key lessons. But also, one of the other lessons is learning. I think when I was in it, I was going to workshops and stuff, but I wasn't necessarily reading. I wasn't really kind of trying to fill the skills gaps that I had. I did my master's when I was running the business, but then I wasn't necessarily implementing a lot of the things that I'd learned on the master's, and I wasn't necessarily making use of my networks in the way that I know now to do. So it was kind of, I always love that, and that the picture that you saw, the video that you see where they've got the swan and the legs are paddling underwater furiously, but then calm above water. Sorry, my Alexa. Should have turned it off. Alexa, I don't know why I keep leaving it off. Sorry about that. And I was that, so I was outwardly, and it was really crazy because at the point where the business was seemingly to be so successful and I was winning all the awards, it was at that point that I was paddling furiously, but I wasn't reaching out to get support, to get advice from those within my network. And that's something now that I'm really passionate about. And a lot of the time it was kind of just dip my head in the water, focus on this kind of one thing with unlimited big venture challenge, and that's going to solve my problems. Whereas now, one of the key things I always say to my clients is you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. Look at loads of different opportunities, and don't hold out hope on one thing being the savior of your business. And also, I wasn't being strategic enough, so I was being very operational. The business was heavily reliant on me, which is why with what I do with She's the Boss, the key focus of what I kind of teach my clients is around not building a business that's reliant on you. And because I was so passionate about the things that I was doing, I wanted to do everything. Yeah. And even though I had staff, at one point I had 8 members of staff, it was kind of like they weren't really there to do anything that particularly important. It was just kind of having staff for having staff's sake, because I wanted to do everything. And that was, that was where one of the kind of key reasons as well why the business wasn't able to continue, because had I built the business around the systems and processes so that the staff were able to be empowered and to take on some of the work that I was doing, then potentially I could have achieved those sales in 6 months, and I could have gone away from the business and it would have continued. But because the business was so heavily reliant on me, once you took me out of the business, there wasn't really any business left. And that was a huge lesson for me, that I'm always banging on about not building an owner reliant business.
Really good key point, actually. I think that sort of, an owner reliant business. So and has that then kind of helped you in surrounding yourself with good people? Then is kind of like not being an owner reliant business, have the right people around you. Is that what's really helped you go through these sort of innovation stages that we all need to, and very much obviously we need at the moment? Everybody's talking about pivoting your business. We've discussed it in some of the other webinars, but how do we do that? How do we innovate? We're not perhaps always quite sure, particularly at the moment, what our new markets and our new customer base and our new services are even going to be. So that is, I think, really interesting about how we drive that innovation at this particular time of needing to focus on growth.
Well, I think for me, one of the key things is looking at what your customers want and need. And I think a lot of businesses, and I talk about this a lot with my clients, a lot of businesses have a business-focused approach to innovation. So it's inward-looking as opposed to a customer-centered approach. And I always advocate for a customer-focused approach. So what are the problems that the customers are facing, and how can you do what you do better, or how can you create something new to fulfill or to solve those problems or fulfill the needs that they have? And one of the key things that is essential is actually going out and speaking to people. And again, going back to the kind of lessons I learned with my first business, I didn't go out really and do much market research. I didn't really segment I didn't really create customer personas or profiles. So I didn't necessarily know exactly who I was targeting. It was just, okay, I'm going to target some businesses, maybe in the IT sector, maybe in kind of this sector, but I wasn't really drilling down who the customers are, what are their problems, and what can I do to solve them, and also verifying and validating. So within any innovation process, I think it's really important to not only to create kind of customer profiles and personas that outline who your customers are, but actually going out and finding people that fit that description and verifying the assumptions, because it's all assumptions. I can sit here and say, well, I think that my clients need this, or this is a problem that they have. But until I ask, it's an assumption. And I think it's really important to make sure it's validated. And also looking to other industries. So I love the book, Blue Ocean Strategy. It's something that a book that I always recommend. I've got on my Instagram page, I have a review, because I think it's a fantastic book. And one of the things that it's not necessarily about just innovation, it's about finding uncontested market spaces, which I think at this point is slightly impossible. So I use it specifically for developing new value propositions and looking at being more innovative. But one of the key things it mentions is around looking at what is standard in your industry. What can you, so I've got something called the 4 grid or something. What can you reduce? What can you create? What can you eliminate? And what can you raise above industry standards? And I do this with my clients, and I get them to also look at what is happening in other industries that you could take and implement within your business that's going to differentiate you or provide a new and innovative solution to a problem that your customers or clients may be facing. And I think that's a really useful process for people to sit down and really to really look around different marketplaces and think about what can you incorporate into what you're doing, as opposed to just sitting there and saying, okay, what am I going to do today that's going to be creative? Well, no, there's people out there doing amazing things that actually, if you can take it and put it into your industry, can create something fantastic and wonderful. And I think Netflix, for example, I think is a really good example of this. We watched TV in a very specific way previously, and Netflix came along and kind of looked at different industries. So you had the video rental, then you also had the TV, you also had the cinema, and they combined everything to create something quite new. It's not new anymore, but at the time it was. And look how successful they've been. Whether they're profitable or not is a different conversation. But in terms of popularity, they've done really well in creating something that was new and innovative at the time. And I think there's some of the key tips that I would recommend. So speaking to your customers, looking across industries, being clear on who your customers and clients are and understanding their problems, and looking at what you can do within your industry that is not standard to your industry and maybe standard to another industry.
That's really, really helpful, Daniela, and really interesting that we've already put up on the chat room the link on Wikipedia about the Blue Ocean strategy. So I'm sure that perhaps there's some of those things that you've just talked about there that we can include in the follow-up email to the webinar when the video is released, if that would be really helpful to people. And I think just that sort of then moving on to the final section that I know you wanted to talk to about these kind of strategies for growth. So it's great when we kind of go, right, we've looked at our customers and we've done all that. And I think those are some real golden nuggets in there that you've talked about. So that's strategy for growth. What if people are going to start doing something on Monday, kind of thing? The kind of they've done the strategic, and they've got to kind of blend that with the actual action and getting on with it. What would you sort of recommend to us there?
The first thing I always recommend is doing a SWOT, because just because something sounds like a great idea doesn't mean that you're best placed to actualize it. And then there's also something that comes out of the SWOT called a toes matrix. So that's looking at all of the different strategies that you can execute for your business and picking ones that are going to be possible, or what is the best course of action for your business. I think that is one of the key things that I would focus on. In this time specifically, I've been working a lot with clients on articulating their visions as well, because also what you don't want to do is jump on different strategies or new innovations that don't align with your long-term plan for your business and for yourself. So work out where you're trying to go. I probably said this in the wrong order actually. So start with the vision first. So work out where you're trying to go. Then look at, okay, what strengths, weaknesses do you have? What are the opportunities and threats you need to be aware of? Then using a toes matrix, which you can find these easily online, then work out what are the different strategies that you can execute. And that's where you combine kind of your strengths. So you have your SW, so where you combine your strengths with your weaknesses to find a strategy, your opportunities with your threats with your strengths, to create a variety of different strategies. And then work out which ones, based on the vision that you're trying to actualize, which ones are best suited for you. And then break things down into small tasks. So what's the overall goal that you're trying to achieve with the specific strategy? How do you actualize that? So what are the key actions that you need to complete in order to actualize the strategy and then achieve the goal? And I find that breaking things down into smaller chunks makes it much more advantageous. It's just easier to do. It's not as overwhelming if you're looking at smaller chunks on a regular basis, as opposed to daily looking at this big, massive goal that you're trying to achieve. And then also looking at the resources, the partners, the networks that can support you in, I suppose, achieving what you're trying to do. So for me, for example, one of my key strategies at the moment is around raising my personal profile through doing things like this. So one of the key strategies is then looking at who do I build relationships with that is going to enable me to do that. Who can introduce me to the people that I need to be introduced to get onto these kind of platforms. But again, I can't do that all in one day. It's an ongoing process. So I break it down into chunks. So this week I'm focusing on, I don't know, maybe it's focusing on contacting people that do podcasts. Then next week it's contacting people that have YouTube channels. Then the following week it might be looking at more kind of print media. So it's about breaking things down into small tasks. And when you're looking at the specific strategies that you're employing, making sure that you're not just doing things because it sounds like a good idea, but actually, is this the best way to achieve the goals that you set out for yourself? Is this the best way of engaging with your target customers or your target clients? Is this the best way? Is it the best use of your time? Because that's the other thing. There may be specific strategies that you think maybe I should go down that route, but actually, is it going to be value for money and for time? If it's going to take you, a year to do something that's only going to give you back a very small return, is there a point in doing it? So also making sure that you're focusing on the finance and the time that it's going to take to fulfill a goal and to actualize a strategy. I feel like that was really wordy, but I hope it makes sense.
Don't worry, there's some really valuable insights in there. And I think one of the things for me is obviously, you know, SWOT sort of analysis. Probably most people who are on this call have done a SWOT analysis of their business or situation at some point. But actually, that's the first time I've actually heard that align with the choose matrix. So that's a really interesting one. That's going to be one of my takeaways. To go and explore that a lot more, and I think that, you know, refocus, make sure you don't get distracted, because it's so easy in this current climate at the moment that we can get a little bit distracted, particularly chasing funding pots, and all of a sudden as social enterprises, you know, we've become quite grant reliant over the last 4 months. And going back to one of your earlier points, kind of making sure that we do keep that focus on coming back into being trading social enterprises, not grant reliant. And actually that sounds like the sort of projecting forwards, doing that 3, 6 month, 12-month SWOT analysis of what your business will be, your marketplace will be, bringing in the customer side of it that you talked about, and then doing that alignment to still stay true to your goals, be authentic to your mission, your vision, but actually streamline those kind of attitudes and the strategies that you're going to take to really sort of go for that growth platform. Would that be a good quick summary?
Yeah, I always say to my social enterprise clients, are you a business or are you a funded project? And I think that is a distinction that a lot of social entrepreneurs need to sit and ask. Am I a series of funded projects, or am I a business? And if you're a business, funding should be there to top up, not to hold you up. And if it's holding you up, the problem that you have is when that funding is removed, which it can be at any given point, what are you left with? And if you're left with nothing and just another, and you're just sitting thinking, okay, now I'm going to have to find another funding stream to be able to generate some income, then you're running a series of funded projects. And that's why I think it's so important for social entrepreneurs to really be clear on where the revenue is coming from a commercial perspective, because funding is not guaranteed. Nothing is really guaranteed, but funding in particular. And we saw when we had the last recession, I remember it clearly, a lot of social went out of business, and it was because they were reliant on funding. The new government came in. Sorry, one moment. The new government came in and took.
Don't worry about it, Daniela. We're absolutely fine with it. Don't worry.
Yeah, the new government came in, pulled all of the funding pots, and loads of social enterprises were left without any means of income, and therefore went bankrupt. And what we don't want to see is that happen again. So it's really important to look at what are the commercial income streams. And sometimes those two things can be really heavily intertwined. So I know, for example, Miss Macaroon is a great social enterprise I always use as an example, because their commercial revenue is generated through selling the macaroons, and then they use that money to then provide training for the ex-offenders. And they've managed to really to do that really effectively, and then use funding as a top-up as opposed to a hold-up of the business.
Yeah. I think that I like that phrasing, top-up as a funding as a top-up, not a hold-up. So yeah. Does everybody want to take themselves off mute? And I think, Daniela, if you're happy, we'll just have sort of 5 minutes open Q&A. If anybody's got a burning question they'd like to kind of put through to Daniela. Suzanne, you've got your hand up very politely.
Hi, Daniela. Thank you so much. I think I'm wrestling with a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about this morning. We're a very new enterprise, and we're just running on grant at the moment. And my business partner is from a business background. Well, I'm completely all about funded projects, and I'm struggling a bit with the whole, but the money's coming in, it's fine, we can keep going. And she's going, no, but we need to bring in, we have to find something that brings in to cover core, because we can't, obviously, how are we paying for our website? We're not paying for anything, any core costs, we're just paying ourselves, and that's fine. But my question is, so thank you so much, because I feel like, okay, I have to listen a bit more to her now. Because
she's got some great podcasts, so hook on to YouTube channel and podcasts.
My question was, when you were setting up your businesses, did you have any startup funding? Because this is the bit I'm struggling with. There's so much to do, and all the strategy stuff, all the vision. We know we need to do it, but when do we do this? Because I feel we're not getting paid for this bit. This is the bit we're doing in our own time, so it's kind of dropping off. Was there any startup funding available to you?
So interestingly, my first business, we applied for Princess Trust Fund, and to this day, I think it's probably the worst mistake that I ever made, because again, what it did is it enabled us to go out and buy all these things and say, oh, we're in business, without having to generate any of the income ourselves. And that kind of was it was a start as you mean to go on kind of situation. So we started with a loan, and it just continued with getting grants and funding. With She's the Boss, I haven't had any external funding, and I've made more money independently, like commercially, with She's the Boss in like 3 months of starting than I did in a year with the previous business. And the reason, I think the core reason behind that is because I was forced to go out and try and get sales. And this doesn't apply to everyone, but for me personally, I think having to go out and get sales to be able to pay for the things I needed, i.e. this banner sitting behind me, because I knew there was nobody giving me money to do it, I then knew I had to get sales. So at the moment, I've got a number of key things that I want to do over the next 12 months, and I'm having to look and say, okay, it's going to cost this much, so how many sales do I need to get to be able to do that? And that's what I'm focusing on. Luckily for me, I also have a part-time contract that pays me very well for doing pretty much the same thing that I do in my business. And I also have a husband, so I know that I'm not going to be destitute if the business doesn't make any money. And for me, that has actually been a big help. Whereas with my first business, I didn't have any of those things. So I kind of needed that funding. But as I said, I think had I not had the funding, one of two things would have happened. One, I would have been forced to work out how to generate sales to pay for the things that I needed. Or number two, I would have realized that this business model doesn't make sense. So either I don't proceed with the business or I change the business model. And again, I think the startup funding, unless, I always say, unless you have a large capital expenditure at the beginning, or like you're building an app or something that's going to cost 30 grand, if you can try and kind of work it out. And I think somebody mentioned, I saw something pop up in the screen, the lean startup approach. I think if you can try and bootstrap and just work it out as you go along, I would always recommend that, unless you really have a big expenditure that you can't cover for yourself. So I just really think it gets you into the bad habit of relying on other people to pay for stuff. And it doesn't give you an impetus to have to generate income. If you're already that way inclined, I think great, take some of the money if you can, but make sure that you have a strategy for replacing it. And I think that's where a lot of social enterprises that I've encountered, including myself, go wrong, is they take the money with maybe some sort of kind of strategy. So I know with one of our projects, for example, we took the funding on with the kind of thinking that we'd commercialize the products that would be developed through the project. But then we didn't have to. So we kind of called a few schools, do you want to buy this school program? And then nobody wants to buy, okay, so we're not going to call anybody anymore, and kind of left it at that. Whereas had we paid, or had to work out, or had we created it and then known that in order to pay staff or pay for the production, it was coming out of my own pocket, I'm sure that I would have kind of been a little bit more urgent with trying to get the sales. So the answer is yes and no, but ideally no if you don't need it.
Thank you. That's good advice.
That's great, thanks. Does anybody else have a sort of burning question that they'd like to sort of chat about?
Yeah.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah. Well, I just want to ask, I think it's been really, really interesting and really useful. I'm right at the start of the whole social enterprise journey, and I think what you say about, are you a funded project or are you a business? This is exactly what's sort of going round and round my mind. At the moment, what I have is a funded project. What I want to do is make it sustainable, and the general advice has been to make that a CIC rather than, say, a charity. What I'm it seems to me that what you have to do to make a good CIC, from what you're saying, is that you have to be really good at doing two things. So you have to be good at making the macaroons, for example, and then training, the people you want to train and so forth. And it seems to me that what I'm doing well at the minute is the training people, which is what it does. It trains writers project. And I'm just wondering how you get that balance. Is it, do you sort of think of spending, say half the year is on making the macaroons, and then, half, obviously not quite like that, but, like half the year is on making the macaroons, and half the year is on delivering the training. How do you make that balance? And yeah, I suppose that's what I'm like finding most challenging at the moment, and thinking whether I should actually establish it as CIC, or whether it's just not the right thing.
I think that is one of the significant challenges of being is about finding that balance.
Sorry, Daniel, that's it. You're a little bit quiet then.
Yeah.
When you started that answer.
Move back to
oh, the sounds.
Yeah.
Sorry, the sound's gone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better, Daniela. Thank you.
Strange. Yeah, no, I was saying, I think that's one of the significant challenges of being a social entrepreneur, is that you are juggling, but just being an entrepreneur generally, because whatever business you run, you're generally going to be doing in the first stages everything. And I think where it becomes the unique thing with the social entrepreneur is, a lot of the time, as I said previously, our heart is with the social impact, and we want to spend time doing that because that's what we love, that's what we're passionate about. But we do have to make time for the commercial side. And sometimes I think what can be useful is if the two things can be entwined. Not all social entrepreneurs or social enterprises are able to do that. But for example, if you are a training provider, can you provide your free training for your kind of your community of impact, whilst then providing similar training to a commercial or corporate space and get paid for that? Because then you're not necessarily doing two things, you're doing the same thing but for two different markets. And I think that can sometimes make that process a little bit easier to manage.
Yeah, I think that could potentially, yeah.
And a lot of social entrepreneurs that I've supported sell directly into either schools or public sector, but that can also come with a whole range of challenges. Trying to sell into schools, I don't know if anyone's tried it, but that can just be an absolute nightmare. So for me, if you can provide something that is sold to either the corporates, SMEs, or to business to consumer, I personally think that's an easier route to do it. And again, Miss Macaroon is an excellent example of that. Also, Sisters in Coaching, I remember they used to do counselling, but commercially. So for anybody who wants counselling, they could go and get counselling, but then also they'd provide free or subsidised counselling for hard to reach individuals.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Daniela. Sorry, a bit of a croaky voice there. Thank you so much, Daniela. That's just been a fascinating session. I think, we all really appreciate your time and the insights. From my side, we'll put out the follow-up to the webinar once we've got the video finally edited, and I'll look to include some of those links, etc. Sorry, Kieran, you've just asked a very quick question. The counselling social enterprise is Martin Hogg, and he runs Citizen Coaching in Birmingham. They have the contract for the Birmingham counselling services. If you need a further introduction or anything, please do just drop me an email. I'm more than happy to introduce you to Martin. He's a super warm, helpful person. And Daniela, there's a lovely little quote there from Suzanne. Thank you so much, Daniela. Inspiring stuff. Really glad I joined this webinar. So if I can close on that one, have a fabulous day, everybody. And we really appreciate your time. Final check, the next webinar, we are now going to move to monthly webinars. We appreciate everybody's got a lot of work going on. They're sort of trying to actually be operational, strategic, tactical, and also we've got sort of a little bit more freedom to move around. So people are taking much needed restorative holidays and time out. which is really so important to reflect on their own businesses. So the next webinar is Wednesday the 19th of August, and we're going to be looking at digital transformation in a low-tech environment, which I think is going to be a really interesting one, where we've all kind of like had to fast forward things like apps that you've talked about, Daniela, moving things onto Zoom platforms and online generally. And that's going to be with Pauline Roche, who is one of the co-founders of R&R organisation, who are tech leads across the West Midlands. So we hope that you'll join us for that one. Links will be sent out as usual. And I just wish you all a peaceful, enjoyable week, a restorative week, a little bit of self-care as well. And Daniela, thank you so much. Some really, really lovely comments coming up there about all that you shared with us today. So perfect.
Well, if anyone's on Instagram, I'm at She's the Boss INTL. I'm on LinkedIn, Daniela Genus, and also on YouTube, She's the Boss. I have about 70 interviews with female entrepreneurs, many of whom are social enterprises. So if you want to check that out as well.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. See you all in August, everybody. Daniela, goodbye. Lovely. Bye.
Bye.